Hi, Jenny. We're here today to do another astrobiography.
Hi, Laurie.
Hi. So for the astrobiographies, what we do, for those of you who haven't seen any of these, we just really decide on a person and we talk about their chart. Why would we do such a thing, Jenny?
We are doing this so you can learn how to do astrology with people in the news.
Yeah. You know, it really is a great way to kind of get an idea of how we look at things, how to look at someone's chart.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much information out there in the world right now around astrology, around mundane astrology, how the cycles and what's going on in the astrological weather day to day, month to month. There's so much of that. And, you know, for me personally, and I think you probably agree with me, you know, the natal chart is really what's important to me. You know, I mean, the cycles are important. Of course, they impact all of us. But I really love working with individual people and individual charts. And there is no shortage of fascinating people out there for us to talk about. So who are we going to talk about today?
Today we're going to talk about Simone Biles, since we are in the Olympic season right now. And it was funny because we picked her chart like a couple weeks ago, and then lo and behold, she popped up in the news just yesterday. So it totally makes sense to do her chart. And I think what's really cool about doing this is just you kind of get to see the patterns of astrology and how they manifest in these individual people. So it's pretty cool. And I always enjoy doing these with you, Laurie. So yeah. Simone.
Okay, so that's who, and that's why we're doing it now. And, you know, one of the ways that I really recommend people work with famous people's charts is to find a documentary that really kind of lays out their life and you can watch how it shows up in the natal chart. It's such a great learning tool. So the documentary I watched was on Amazon Prime, and it is called The Simone Biles Story, The Courage to Soar. And you watched something different, didn't you?
Yeah, I watched, there's a series on Facebook, and it's this sort of 20-minute clips of her, and I think there's 5 or 6 of them that focus on different segments of her life and kind of track what she's doing. So it's really different, and I think it's cool that we looked at different things because it doesn't really matter. So to find the Facebook one, go to Simone Biles' Facebook page, and you'll find it right on her page. Where was your documentary?
It's on Amazon Prime.
Okay.
And it did, you know, I had to rent it for $2.99. So yeah, there's that. Okay, so if you've got the chart, why don't we open it up and take a look?
Okay, so here we have Simone Biles, the incredible gymnast who is at the Olympics right now as we speak.
And they say they say that she's the best gymnast in the world, don't they?
Yeah, so it's the greatest of all time. So she's the GOAT. That's what GOAT stands for. And so you'll notice if you look at her uniform, it's actually kind of a nerdy astrology thing, because when you look at her uniform, she has a little goat sewed onto her uniform. And I love it because one of the prominent features of her chart has to do with Saturn, which is tied in with the goat.
That's pretty interesting. That is interesting. Okay.
So, but where do you want to start? Probably with that little piece of Pisces down there, huh?
Well, you know, there's a lot of different places we could start. Clearly, there's a big focus there in the 4th house. One of the things I want to say that, you know, one of the first things that jumps out at me is almost everything is below the horizon. Her Mars is up here, but it's retrograde. The moon is just barely there by the horizon. But for the most part, we've got a chart that is so focused below the surface, which when I see that, I think, you know, there's some struggles, some challenges to, you know, from the early home life. I also think with this chart, it's so fun to think about, and I've just been obsessed with this thought recently when I look at charts, is what would the sky look like if the minute she was born, she was brought outside and laid on a blanket in a field. And you look at that, it was dark. It was an extremely dark night. Looking straight up, you might have been able to see, it was so dark, you could probably see that red Mars up there at the very top of the chart, and the moon just about to drop below the horizon. But yeah, that focus in the fourth house. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. This is a lot of Pisces. She's born March 14th, 1997. She's 24 years old. And so we have a lot of Pisces in the fourth house. So think about that for a second. There's a bunch of different ways you can look at it, but I think right away you can think about just something elusive about the home life, or something that wasn't quite as it seemed about the home life, something a little bit perhaps missing, or those kinds of things. And those things are right. Like, she came from a mother who had some drinking problems, and was not able to take care of the children she had. So she kind of pretty early on lost her mother in that way. I mean, her mother's still in the scene, but just not able to raise her. But then she had kind of a short stint in the foster care system, and then she ended up being adopted by her grandparents, her maternal grandparents, and ended up having just a great support system in her family life. Yeah. So that kind of shows you the breadth of Pisces. On one hand, you have this like struggles with addiction, and then on the other hand, you have this almost ideal family life that appears. So that's kind of what I think.
It is really interesting. And I just want to say, it was her grandfather and his wife. The woman wasn't actually her biological grandmother, but she really became her mom. I mean, this, I think it's really interesting that the planets involved here. Some people would call this a stellium because it's 3 planets. I would not call it a stellium. It's definitely a focus. But Venus and Mercury and the sun are always very close together. They're never very far apart. So they come together so frequently. And one of the things, in Noel Till's teaching, he talked about that stellium of the Venus, Mercury, and Sun as being a statement of idealism.
Yeah, so that's a great thing to add, because so then what you have before you've even looked at anything else is you have 2 suggestions around idealism. Got the idealism of Pisces, and then that Venus, Mercury, Sun together. And I love how they're kind of stationed in this chart, where they're like on either side of the sun. So they're the emissaries of the sun, which is a helpful thing to think about. Cool. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I guess for me, there's a bunch of different ways we could go from here, because there's some pretty cool, interesting stuff. But I guess just in keeping, I would look at Mars next, because it's opposing that stellium in Pisces. So it's kind of a natural thing your eye gets drawn to.
And I want to just say on that point, I mean, Mars is definitely the next thing to look at here. But when we're talking about someone who's famous in any particular way, if it's somebody born 100 years ago that we talk about today, or if it's someone who's well known in the public, the place we're going to look is the midheaven, because that's the career, or the public, the most public part of the self, the reputation and the career. So there she has her midheaven and Mars, and the nodal axis is mixed in here as well. But the Mars right up there on the midheaven. Now, if somebody came to me and had midheaven right on the Mars right on the midheaven, I'm going to immediately want to know what they do in their career that involves Martian activities. And it being in Virgo, there has to be a very perfectionistic strength. You watch her perform, you want to talk about perfection and strength. Holy, I won't say anything terrible here.
Well, it's interesting, because you think of, you might think, you think Pisces, and it's like, you're not necessarily going to immediately think athlete, right? Like, you're just not. But the minute you look up there, just as you said, the perfection and the strength, It brings you up to that Mars, and that kind of helps you understand it. And it's in opposition to those planets. So it really brings that kind of polarity together. So,
right. And it's like the idealism of the home or the suffering of the home, whichever way, and she clearly embodied or experienced both the suffering in the early home and the idealism in the home. And that really propels her to that strength and perfectionism in the career. And then that Mars, because it rules Aries, it rules her 5th house, which is creativity. And the creativity of this woman in her work is, it's beautiful to see.
Yeah. And and also, I mean, the 5th house is that place of play and risk taking, which is very much signified by her choice of career. So yeah, I think it that says a lot. And then I don't know about you, Laurie, but kind of what I start thinking of next is just that Saturn is there in Aries in the 5th house. So Saturn is going to work really, really hard. So this is where you see her just really putting in the time and effort that it needs to take in order to express herself through that Aries in the 5th house. So it brings together the hard work, the kind of pioneer and self development aspect into how she's going to create herself through gymnastics. I mean,
yeah, and that's the only fire she has. I mean, she's got the fire of her rising sign and Pluto, but basically this is the biggest fire piece as far as planet, the original planets.
And I know you and I have been talking, Laurie, about how we both have incorporating a little bit more of kind of ancient astrology into our Hellenistic astrology into some of the things we look at. And I only bring that up here because there's an extra statement being made by Saturn in Aries. And Saturn in Aries, it's not a place it really wants to be necessarily. Like Saturn is exalted in Libra. And so in Aries, it's sort of the opposite. It's sort of the pauper. It's like, and I'm saying this because what it also says is that she has to work even extra hard. Like it just shows you how much effort she has had to put in to overcome her limitations and become this incredible athlete.
Right. So that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of that, but yeah, absolutely. That Saturn is not happy in Aries, is it?
Oh,
it really is
cranky.
Yeah, it's cranky there. Another thing that I think is really, whoops, I don't want to use a red line when I mean a blue line. And for those of you who are paying attention, the red lines I put up are always kind of stressful or areas of effort. The blue lines represent ease and flow. And what I see here is a grand trine between Mars, the moon, and Neptune. Is that, yes, Neptune. It's not a perfect grand trine because this is in air and these two are in earth. The Uranus does also trine it, but it is a grand trine. And I think that it's worth paying attention to that grand trine because, a grand trine, back in the old days, people would see a grand trine, they'd talk about good luck and good fortune and everything wonderful comes to this person. And there is an element of that, but there's also a struggle in a grand trine of feeling like you're kind of alone in the world. There's a self-sufficiency. It's a closed circuit here. Where from the outside, people tend to see her and think, oh, Simone, she's got it all together. She doesn't need us. There's a certain feeling that people probably have that she's got it all together. And a grand trine often is also used, especially in early childhood, as a bit of a defense mechanism. I don't need anybody. I don't need anybody. I'm fine. I've got all this suffering, but I can use it as idealism. I can, just float on this grand trine and make everything look great. But I think, I think grand trines are challenging for people.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, Laura, because it ties in with something when I was watching the documentaries that I was looking at. She talked about how she's a fake it till I make it person. That, and I think this Grand Trine really reflects that, where she's just kind of like, I'm just gonna act like I got this, and then,
Yeah.
but then she does. She figures
Yeah.
it out. So
Yeah.
that
That's
ties in with that.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Well,
then, of course, I just
yeah,
have to throw that in there.
I know. It's like, so the way out of the Grand Trine is into this, the empowerment of Pluto. That's super powerful.
Right. And there's actually, there's a few ways out of the Grand Trine, because there's that and that, both bring her out of that power of the personality.
Yeah. Yeah. And that Pluto right on the ascendant. So that's something to look for when you see those outer planets, those powerful outer planets right on an angle. That has a lot to say. I mean, that often indicates somebody with there's quite a bit of power at her disposal. Like,
Right.
yeah. So there's
And
that.
with the opposition to the moon, it also brings in the mother issue as well. The difficulty of the mother issue. One of the things that I was just so struck with in the documentary was her attitude around her mother was just, it seemed to me, it looked like she just was kind of shut down. There wasn't any emotional explosions. It was just sort of like disinterest is what it felt like, which the Grand Trine would suggest that, I'm going to pretend I'm not interested, when in reality there's this suffering from the early home, and there's this incredible emotional depth of pain. Really.
Yeah, that's a good description.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think too, then there's this other glaring thing we haven't mentioned yet, which is the fact that with Sagittarius rising, that means Jupiter is the ruler for chart. And look, she has that Jupiter in Aquarius conjunct Uranus. I mean, that's electrifying. And I think that is, so that whole piece is a major component, just because of when you're thinking about rulerships, that Jupiter has a big role to play as the ruler of the ascendant in the whole chart, and it trines the moon. So it was some potent stuff going on there.
And I think, what, she's 23, 24 years old. We don't have a clue what her whole life trajectory is going to be about.
She's so young.
She's so young. But I see this, and I feel like there's something in that that's going to really be exposed over the course of time.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. She's here to do more than that, than just what she's done so far, which is already be like the greatest gymnast of her time. I mean, and then she's going to do some other things. I almost.
And what? Okay, so what came up in the news yesterday about her? Why don't you explain that? Because you know more about it than I do.
Well, so yesterday she actually stepped back out of the team in the Olympics. She was having not a great day physically, and she kind of was, I didn't watch it, but I guess she like kind of wobbled in a way that she never does. And she ended up just stepping out and just saying, you know what, I'm not going to compete on the team today. This is not the right thing for me. And at first people thought it was like a medical thing, but then she spoke out and said, no, it's actually my mental health. There's too much going on. It's been a really difficult year. And one of the things that I came to understand from my documentary thing I was watching is that she'd been training for the 2020 Olympics, and it's really intense and it's really stressful. And they were, even on her birthday, March 14th, 2020, she didn't know yet the Olympics are going to be canceled. So they'd been training, and all of a sudden they're canceled and postponed. And so that means that really intense thing needed to go on for another year. So you think about the pressure that an athlete like that is under, and having to extend it a whole nother year. It's really intense.
That's the pressure right there, isn't it? That pressure in the third house, that Uranus and Jupiter, that pressure.
Yeah. And just pressure when you're already at the top of your field, it's like, it's really intense. It's hard to even imagine as a person who's not in that position, right? but I think what was cool was that she really owned it. She came out and said, look, this is what I'm dealing with. This is the pressure athletes are under. And I'm going to step back and allow my teammates to move forwards because I feel like I cannot right now. And I'm going to stay on the sidelines and cheer people on.
It's amazing. And
It's
my
great.
understanding is that people have been really supportive. Her team was really supportive. People have really stepped up and supported her in that decision.
Mhm.
Which
And
is, it's an unimaginable thing for somebody to do. Has anyone ever done anything like that?
I don't think so. I mean, especially, I mean, I'm not sure. There could be, I mean, I can't think of anything.
Yeah.
But it speaks to, like, in gymnastics too, it's like there's a really high expectation. And a lot of the women, they look like little girls. I mean, they're young, but it affects their bodies so much. And I think there's a kind of almost an infantilizing that goes on, especially in that sport. And so I think it's especially courageous and bold to say, no, this is what I need to do and speak out about it, because it's been a hidden thing for a long time. And but from an astrology point of view, she's got Jupiter at 11 degrees of Aquarius. So that means that transiting Saturn has been on that, has been putting even more pressure on that Jupiter Uranus conjunction.
And Uranus has been squaring it. Oh,
you got it.
Yeah. So she just recently, during 2020, she was going through her first Uranus square.
Mm-hmm.
And so now Uranus is squaring her Jupiter from the 6th house, which is where all this practice and preparing goes on.
Oh, and the intensity of the anxiety of it.
The intensity and the anxiety of it, squaring that Jupiter. Saturn's sitting on it saying, you've got to work really hard. Uranus is saying, boy, it's like putting this intense, crazy pressure on her. So and where does that go? It goes right to the ascendant, because that's Jupiter rules the ascendant. So her personality is just under a tremendous amount of pressure, which it's under anyway with Pluto there in her chart.
Yeah. And I can't help but wonder, like, what the end of her June was like, because Mars added into the mix there. Mars was in Leo, and it triggered what I've been noticing, and some of this I certainly learned from you, Laurie, but just in general, like how Mars triggers things. Mars. So you'll see a square, and then Mars will come along, and that's when it'll happen. And I think that Mars came and triggered that, was opposed the Uranus Jupiter. I think it was at the end of June. So just a statement about, like, here's this really intense, volatile part of her chart being triggered by these transits that all of us are experiencing, and this is how it's landed for her. And she's chosen to speak up with that Gemini moon.
It's
about
fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. So good job, Simone.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's anything else I need to say about it. How about you?
No, I think I feel like I do want to say one other thing. I just want to add that was cool in her documentary. She has the moon in the 7th house, and her boyfriend is in that show, and he's so supportive and awesome, and it was so nice to see her. She's like laughing and having a good time with him, and it's really cool. So
I'll have to check that out, because I would love to see that, because she seems like such a solitary person in some ways. Just, I mean, it's all so much about her and what she's doing in the world. I would love to, I'm going to check that out. I would love to see her with a partner that she can enjoy and have fun with. So I would encourage anyone who's interested, get one of those documentaries, watch it with this chart in hand, print out the chart. All the information is right here. Get a copy of this chart, sit with it and watch the documentary. It's such a powerful way to learn. It really is an amazing way to learn how these things play out in the natal chart. So
that's great.
Thank you, Jennie. And you can find Jennie at hiddenpathAstrology.com. You can find me at astrolore.org. And we both have Instagram, Facebook, wherever you want to find us, we're out there. Okay. Thanks so much, Jennie.
Thank you, Laurie. Thanks, everybody.